All right, so this is our third year hosting Winter Wednesdays, which is a partnership between South Hero Land Trust and the Worthen Library. This year, we are hosting talks on local ecology, Vermont history, climate change responses, and of course, Lake Champlain. To learn more about the other upcoming events in the series, check out the Land Trust events page and through the link in the chat. We'd like to extend a thank you to donors, volunteers, and supporters of both the South Hero Land Trust and of the Worthen Library for making these events possible. If you'd like to learn about donating or supporting these organizations at all, there's links in the chat for that as well. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Lake Champlain Basin Program, which does some really vital work on our lake. And I'll invite the Education and Outreach Coordinator, Colleen Hickey, to share a few words about that.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's really nice to see the names popping into the chat. And we see Zoe out in Paul Smith's. Hi, Zoe. We've been meeting a few times lately, and Elizabeth Lee is in there from Westport, New York. So in addition to the Islanders, it's nice that the South Hero Land Trust and Worthen Library is reaching across the lake too. So a great programming effort on your part. We're excited that you have chosen a couple of the grant recipients that the Basin Program has awarded funds to this past year as some of your speakers, with Susan Evans McClure really knocking it out of the park as we start off the 50th anniversary celebration of the Clean Water Act. We're very excited that the Maritime Museum received a grant to do this. They always turn in a quality product, and we're excited to hear Susan's presentation tonight. We should also let you know that we did a shout out to the Maritime Museum's efforts when the EPA was up last week for a press conference at the Lake Champlain, Echo at the Leahy Center on Lake Champlain. And we used the first banner that the Maritime Museum will be using as part of their traveling exhibit to give a shout out to the work of the EPA and the Clean Water Act. So it's a really nice tie-in. The South Hero Land Trust has also been a grant recipient in the past and done a super job with their naturalist program as well. So thank you very much for hosting this, and we really look forward to Susan's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. So yeah, today marks the third event in the Winter Wednesday series, and we're really excited to host the Executive Director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, Susan Evans McClure. And she's helping us commemorate the Clean Water Act's 50th anniversary, or birthday, if you rather, by sharing with us some of the founding, the impact, and the legacy of the legislation. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Susan for the Clean Water Act at 50.
Good evening, everyone. Get my presentation all queued up here. Oops. I'll start by acknowledging that we are in the homeland and unceded territory of the Abenaki people. The Abenaki have been here since time immemorial and continue to be a thriving Indigenous culture in our region. We acknowledge with gratitude their generations of stewardship, past, present, and future. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Susan Evans McClure, and I'm the Executive Director of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Thank you to the South Hero Land Trust and the Worthen Library and to the Lake Champlain Basin Program for all of their support of this work and inspiration to have us dig into this topic. But before we get started, I'll share a little bit about Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. So this is our 3-acre waterfront campus. It does not look like this right now, but it will again at some point. We're located just outside of Vergennes, Vermont. And we're a museum dedicated to inspiring people to make connections to Lake Champlain through our region's history, ecology, and archaeology. We believe that when people see themselves in the past, they make a stronger commitment to building a healthy future for all of us and for the lake and for our communities. The museum opened in 1985, and today we welcome around 10,000 students and visitors to experience our exhibits, our boat building and rowing programs, and our educational outreach each year. Our team also conducts new archaeological research and stewards our collection of objects, research materials, and archives. The COVID-19 pandemic and the national reckoning on racial justice have given us a chance to really assess what is important to us and what we want to achieve in partnership with our community. And to us, it's all about access. The lake and the history that lies within it belong to the people of Vermont and New York and a little bit of Quebec. And we want to make it possible for everyone to experience that for themselves with no barriers to that access. So we no longer charge admission to the museum, thanks to the support of many generous supporters, including the Basin Program. So it's free to visit, and all of our summer camps for kids are on a pay-what-you-can model. We're also taking steps to make our campus and our programs more physically accessible and working hard to make the lake and the lake's underwater cultural heritage more accessible to everyone. We open for the 2022 season on May 21st, so mark your calendars. And until then, we're offering virtual programming and a digital museum visit experience on our website, where we hope you will visit us as well. So as we know, because we're gathered here today, it is the 50th birthday of the Clean Water Act this year. And the Clean Water Act was the nation's first comprehensive legislation protecting water quality. And life in the Champlain Valley has always been and continues to be deeply connected to the water of Lake Champlain. But this monumental legislation expanded federal protection of the waters of the United States, paving the way for policies, protections, and funding dedicated toward clean water. Subsequent amendments of the act to the act strengthened protections for Lake Champlain, creating the Lake Champlain Basin Program and helping to protect the water of our lake for generations to come. So many of you have probably seen this image before. It is a map of the Lake Champlain Basin created by the Basin Program. And Lake Champlain is 120 miles long and located between 2 states and 2 countries. And not only is the lake itself central and fascinating and historic and all of the things that make my job endlessly interesting, it's also part of this much larger basin shown here on the map. So the basin itself is 8,234 square miles, which is actually 19 times larger than the surface area of the lake itself. And all of this region's interconnected environment and people and industry and outputs impact what's happening below the water's surface. The indigenous communities of Lake Champlain have also always had a strong relationship between the people and the water. The Abenaki community have been present in this region, which we now call Vermont, since time immemorial and continue to be a thriving indigenous culture. Nebizun is the Abenaki word for medicine, and the root nebi is the Abenaki word for water. As stewards of the environment, Native Americans have led and continue to advocate for clean water. The Abenaki people know how essential water is to foodways and everyday life. Both the Abenaki and the Akwesasne creation stories are based in water. They're not my stories to tell, but if you haven't heard them, I suggest you listen to them told aloud by an Indigenous community member. And in this image, Vera Longto-Sheehan, a member of the Elnu Abenaki tribe and the director of the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association, is making a traditional fish net. And she's shown next to a painting by Abenaki artist Francine Poitras-Jones, which is titled Water is Life. The painting is on display in the Vermont Abenaki Artist exhibit, Nebizun Water is Life, which will be on display at the museum this summer. And while the story I'm telling today is about late 20th century federal legislation, my job is actually to start way before that. So we'll start in my favorite century, the 19th. The 1800s brought industrialization and pollution to the shores of Lake Champlain, altering the landscape and water quality. These changes gave rise to numerous individual and state level concerns about the protection of the lake, which ended up launching an early conservation movement right here in our region. In the years following the War of 1812, the nation underwent a series of economic changes that dramatically changed both the economic and the physical landscapes. In the early 1800s, the exchange of goods occurred in local markets and communities. Some towns, like Burlington, used horse-drawn transportation and carriages to take their goods to other communities and distant as they could get markets. But these transportation methods were slow and costly. This image is of a man named William Montgomery on the stern of his schooner, the J.P. Howard, in the 1880s. And this image is from the Isle of Mont Historical Society, so your neighbors in South Hero. And I will say I have stared at this image and I have I've stared at this image and I've zoomed and zoomed and zoomed to try to figure out what it says is actually in those barrels, but I have no idea what they are. But lots of things were moving in barrels on canal boats in the 19th and 20th century. So by the mid 1800s, the population boomed and the demand for a variety of products increased, which required faster and cheaper transportation methods. In 1817, New York State launched the construction of the Champlain Canal, which workers completed in 1823. The canal linked Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, opening a new world of markets and dramatically decreasing the cost of shipping. The 1825 opening of the Erie Canal connected New York City and the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, ushering in a new era of international and national economic production and trade, where products and people were more tightly connected than ever. The swiftness of canal transportation and the enticing potential for profit wrought physical changes on the landscape of Lake Champlain and its inhabitants. With the opening of the Champlain Canal, the cost to ship goods from Burlington to New York City dropped by 90%. So what used to cost around $10 a ton to ship from Burlington to New York City now costs around $1 a ton. This image is of canal boats in the 1890s and is from Fort Ticonderoga's collection. So to satisfy the demand for products, hundreds of dams, mills, mines, furnaces, charcoal kilns, and farms appeared, using the resources of the water and the forest to sustain their enterprises. Steamboats and canal boats regularly traveled up and down the lake, ready to deliver products and people to distant markets and places. The physical and social changes created by increased transportation and resource extraction had a negative impact on the water quality of Lake Champlain. Deforestation, pollution, runoff, the dumping of waste, and all affected the water quality and ecological systems and harmed both plant and animal life. This image is from the Vermont Historical Society and is actually of Burlington Harbor in the late 1880s. I always like to, all these photos of Burlington are great because you can still kind of see where it is and where the buildings are and make a nice connection. One species that was significantly affected by these changes were salmon. Early travelers to our region noted that Atlantic salmon were living and reproducing in Lake Champlain for centuries before the 1800s. These were salmon who spawned in the rivers that connected to Lake Champlain, but then went all the way back out to the Atlantic Ocean. And in the early 1800s, they were extremely plentiful. Stories of horses being too spooked to cross rivers that were teeming with salmon weren't unheard of. But by 1838, one writer noted that, quote, that the salmon, quote, had abandoned all the waters of the Champlain system. The infrastructure that had positively served the growing economy had destroyed the ability of salmon to live in Lake Champlain. Dams prevented the salmon from being able to reproduce in streams, and the loss of trees increased the runoff from the mountains and land, and mills dumped waste into the lake, polluting the waters. Economic and social expansion came at the cost of environmental damage. The loss of species such as salmon, the poor water quality, and the changing physical landscape all alarmed citizens, writers, and scientific researchers. Travelers, conservationists, and naturalists such as DeWitt Clinton, Charles Sprague Sargent, and George Perkins Marsh recorded their observations of the lake and its inhabitants for scientific reports. They connected industrialization with the environmental changes and damaged ecosystems, which showed a scientific understanding of the world that would launch an early conservation movement that would spread to the nation. And local and state governments also took notice of these changes, and they used reports that these early conservationists were writing to create their own agencies to try to reduce the harm being done to the environment. Quebec, Vermont, and New York all established fish commissions to regulate fishing in Lake Champlain, and the federal government soon followed, creating the Federal Commission for Fish and Fisheries in 1871 to protect fish in lakes and rivers across the United States. New York also passed two bills, one in 1892 and one in 1894, to create the Adirondack Park and designate it as forever wild to protect the region's waterways and forests. So as the 19th century ended, and that I promise was the shortest jaunt through the 19th century I possibly could have said, every aspect in life in and around Lake Champlain had changed. Local community markets had transformed into distant national ones. The Atlantic salmon that had once densely populated the lake disappeared. as did the forest surrounding the lake itself. In the wake of these changes, an early conservation movement formed that would set the stage for later years to come. So at the start of the 20th century, we're fast forwarding to the 20th century, which someone told me recently that the 20th century was 22 years ago, and I freaked out, but it's true. The 20th century was 22 years ago. At the start of the 20th century, ongoing scientific research was documenting the impact of pollution on Lake Champlain, but little political action was being taken on water quality. In 1905, following a series of complaints from residents about the discharge of waste into Lake Champlain from mills, the Department of the Interior commissioned a report on pollution in the lake. The report detailed a series of concerns about the declining water quality and issued a dire warning to Burlington residents. Without any sewage treatment plants, the residents of Burlington in 1905 were discharging their raw waste directly into the lake. As the investigator writing this report bluntly stated, the residents of Burlington were, quote, drinking from their own cesspool. Clean water efforts were gaining attention as their impacts affected the lives of people living in the region. And this is an image of the cover of that report, the preliminary report on the pollution of Lake Champlain, which was printed by the government printing office in 1905. So it's not as though the federal government were doing nothing at this point in the early 1900s, but it was doing pretty close to nothing. In 1899, the Rivers and Harbors Act was passed, which was the first legislation to tackle pollution. And it gave authority to the Army Corps of Engineers to issue permits for discharging refuse into navigable waterways. Then in 1948, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was passed, which was the precursor to the Clean Water Act. It provided state and local governments with funds to address water pollution problems. The primary responsibility and power regarding water quality still rested with the states. And that is where the power, or lack thereof, lay until the Clean Water Act in 1972. In our area here, one of the longtime polluters was International Paper Company's Ticonderoga Creek paper mill on the lake's New York shores. And it's actually the Ticonderoga paper story that pushes legislators to see the need for federal regulation and not just state regulation of water. The plant had been in operation since the early 1800s, and it had consistently dumped runoff and sludge into the lake, causing pollution and harming the ecosystem. The image here is courtesy of the Ticonderoga Historical Society and shows the mill in what they believe was the late 50s and early 60s. So in 1970, then Vermont Attorney General and future Senator Jim Jeffords spearheaded legal efforts against IPC. And he argued that they were not so IPC argued that they were not the only manufacturer contributing to pollution in New York, so they should not face financial repercussions. Jim Jeffords said, no, that's not true. Your pollution is impacting Vermont as well. The case actually went all the way to the Supreme Court and ended in a settlement. International Paper paid $750,000, and Vermont used the money to create a fund to monitor the environmental practices of International Paper's new paper mill. And over the last 40 years, International Paper has faced additional protests and lawsuits targeted at its environmental violations. And at the same time, they've made some tremendous strides to decrease pollution. So as we'll learn in this story, it's a complicated picture. But what was unique about Jeffords' case was that one state, Vermont, was suing a company in another state, New York, for polluting its waters. Vermont couldn't actually regulate International Paper, but Vermont was feeling the negative impacts of International Paper's pollution. And while I know this is not a presentation about Jim Jeffords, I did find this image in the collection of the Vermont Historical Society during my research, and I will never, ever give up the opportunity to highlight one of my favorite categories of historical objects, the campaign potholder. This is a campaign potholder from one of Jim Jeffords' races for Vermont Attorney General in the 70s. It says, "Don't get burned with inexperience, let Jeffords handle the hot issues." And I don't know if anyone has seen or remembers any campaign potholders, but they were ubiquitous in the mid-20th century. And they actually were an attempt to target female voters. There's an idea starting in 19th century American history, often called Republican motherhood, this idea that the home is the domain of the woman, and it's where she can actually flex her political muscle by convincing her husband who to vote for. But once women got the right to vote, the idea was extended into this post-Cold War version of Republican motherhood, in which women were specifically targeted through their connection to the home with campaign materials directed directly at them. So not totally related, but too good to pass up. So moving forward to the middle of the 20th century, a series of devastating environmental events really shined a light on the need to protect the nation's waterways, including Lake Champlain. As the quality of water worsened in waterways across the nation, citizens protested the inaction of their government officials and called upon them to pass legislation to limit discharge and toxic waste in the water. What it finally took was people who joined together at the local, state, and federal levels to push for new regulations to protect the environment. And that culminated with the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. One of the most iconic moments in American history was the burning of the Cuyahoga River, which you see here. By the end of the 1960s, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, was polluted with thick, dark oil that was bubbling at the top, if you can just picture that. You don't want to take a walk near that river. And it actually had repeatedly caught fire. This was not the first catching of fire in 1952. It had repeatedly caught fire through the 1800s and 1900s due to increasing industrialization in the region. And this picture was from November 3rd of 1952. Time magazine reported on another fire on the Cuyahoga River in 1969, and they used this photo to demonstrate that. So there's a few burnings of the river. But the report in Time magazine really horrified the nation, as it should, and galvanized the government into creating the Environmental Protection Agency and eventually passing the Clean Water Act. And this image is from the Cleveland Press collection at the Cleveland State University Library. And it was not only the river, but actually a series of severe environmental disasters mixed with growing anxiety about air and water pollution across the country that led President Richard Nixon to propose the creation of a new agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. And the EPA was approved in 1970. And what it did was consolidate the government's environmental duties under one authority and streamline consistent policies that were aimed at protecting the environment across the country. So we're at 1970. This is we're really jumping through history here, but so we're at 1970 with the EPA, but then the Clean Water Act 2 years after that was born out of decades of smaller legislation and individual and collective action toward protecting the nation's waterways. The various laws aimed at water quality reflected changes in scope and organization of the federal government. And these laws and changes all culminated with the creation of the EPA and then the Clean Water Act. So even it's clear that the EPA didn't solve all the problems by being created, and there was still a concern about water quality. So in 1972, bipartisan congressmen introduced amendments to that 1948 Federal Water Pollution Control Act I mentioned. And the original law in 1948 had only protected interstate waterways from pollution, but the new proposed amendments gave the EPA expanded control over water quality. And under these amendments, the EPA could regulate and implement pollution control programs for waterways, set water quality standards, fund sewage treatment plants, and make it illegal to discharge any pollutants into waterways without permission. And these amendments to the 1948 Water Control Act became the Clean Water Act. So after a series of revisions, as they're wont to do in Congress, the bill passes the House and the Senate in 1972. However, it does get vetoed by Richard Nixon. The cost of the bill was $24 billion, and he deemed it too costly. But both Republicans and Democrats in Congress overwhelmingly overrode the veto, and the Clean Water Act became law on October 19th of 1972, paving the way for safer practices to protect the nation's waterways. And this image is a protest in 1970 in Michigan, where people were protesting pollution in the Huron River. And it's from the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. There's a lot of fun parts of my job. I feel like one of them is calling random libraries and saying, do you have a picture of something that happened in 1970? And usually they do. And then you get amazing images like this. So what did the Clean Water Act actually do? Well, it regulated pollutant discharges in the waters of the United States, which we'll get to in a second, and regulated water quality standards for surface waters. The goal was to reduce water pollution through oversight and control from the EPA. The Clean Water Act created a federally controlled permit system for pollution of navigable waters, specifically aimed at industrial facilities and municipal sewage treatment plants. This aimed to improve water quality and make waters, quote, fishable and swimmable. What it did not do was regulate clean drinking water. That came later with the Safe Water Drinking Act of 1974. What the Clean Water Act did was create a structure for regulating pollutant discharges into what is called the waters of the United States. So often this system is referred to as a permit to pollute system, which means that the system legally required a permit before any pollutant could be discharged into navigable waters or the ocean. So if you think about it, it's kind of strange to say to a company, we don't give you permission to pollute unless you ask us for permission, but then probably you'll get it. But that's the system that was developed from this. And when they said pollutants, they meant solid waste, dredge spoil, incinerator residue, sewage, garbage, sewage sludge, munitions, chemical waste, biological materials, radioactive materials, heat, discarded equipment, rocks, sand, industrial waste, municipal waste, agricultural waste, really all the heavy hitting things you could think of when you think of pollutants. But the permits that they issued addressed what's called point source pollution, meaning pollution that comes from a defined source location, like a paper mill that's dumping pollutants into Lake Champlain. But the Clean Water Act actually did not include what's called non-point source pollution, which is things like sewage overflows after a rainstorm or agricultural runoff, or a pollutant that's carried by snowmelt into a waterway. The Clean Water Act also funded sewage treatment plants construction and gave the EPA authority to implement pollution control programs, such as wastewater standards for various industries. So in doing this research, what I'm often struck by is not so much what the Clean Water Act did, as what it actually didn't do. It didn't regulate non-point source pollution or groundwater, and it didn't regulate drinking water, which is what I often think of, right? When you think of clean water, you think of like what comes out of the tap, not covered by this, but still not to give it short shrift, it was a huge step forward. So awareness of these environmental issues continued to increase after the passage of the Clean Water Act, and the law did not immediately remedy all water quality program problems. The act required subsequent amendments to strengthen it and expand the authority of the EPA. Even then, however, water quality issues persisted. And I talked about non-point source pollution and the example of snowmelt, and the heavy use of salt to de-ice roadways began in the 1940s and continued after the passage of the Clean Water Act and its amendments. And the negative effects of road salt on drinking water and water quality were not really studied by the EPA until the 1970s. And the use of road salt today remains an issue of debate and a hot topic. And in our region, both in New York and Vermont, there's lots of amazing work being done with the community to encourage reduced use of road salt to reduce impact on the environment. The Clean Water Act also set the stage for subsequent policies and actions, including the creation of the Lake Champlain Basin Program in 1990. The Basin Program was an international coalition between the United States and Canada devoted to protecting the waters of Lake Champlain. And in 1990, Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, along with then Vermont Senator Jim Jeffords and New York Senators Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Alphonse D'Amato, introduced the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act of 1990. I swear I feel sometimes like this presentation is just me listing the names of acts, and they're all they have a lot of words and they sound kind of the same, but they're each important in their own way. So actually the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act of 1990 was another amendment to the Clean Water Act. And these elected officials at the time recognized the national significance of Lake Champlain and hoped to secure special federal funds to study it and preserve it. The act was included and passed as part of the Great Lakes Critical Programs Act, which was expansive legislation that used federal funds to protect other waterways such as the Great Lakes. Commitment to protecting the nation's lakes bound some of our elected officials together, even ones who maybe disagreed on other things, and they used their power and status to pass federal legislation. So Senator Leahy from Vermont was really instrumental in the creation and passage of this Lake Champlain Special Designation Act, and he continues to be an advocate for protection of Lake Champlain and other watersheds. And in addition to developing the Basin Program, Senator Leahy has secured funding for preventing the spread of invasive species in water and forests, advocated for ocean conservation, hosted environmental summits on stewardship, and really been a force in cleaning up Lake Champlain. So the Basin Program was born out of this 1990 legislation. And the program was a coordinated effort among federal, state, and local governments who joined together to develop a plan to improve, restore, and maintain water quality of Lake Champlain. And with international cooperation from Quebec, the Basin Program today researches the lake, educates the public on how to play a role in protecting the lake, and funds and implements efforts to protect the inhabitants of our region and water quality. So today, the fight for clean water in the Lake Champlain Basin continues. Individuals play an important role in protecting water quality by engaging in sustainable and protective actions every day. Towns and municipalities are updating their wastewater plans and protecting clean drinking water. And actually, yesterday was town meeting day in Vermont, and there were several Vermont towns that were spending millions and millions and millions of dollars to upgrade their sewer systems, which is so great to see that that is being prioritized through some heavy federal funding. So state and federal officials are elected to uphold and create new policies too that ensure a healthy water future for everyone. Now, after the passage of the Clean Water Act, debates continued. It wasn't all roses and clean water after 1972. The Clean Water Act uses the phrase waters of the United States to refer to the waterways that are regulated under federal control. But this can, depending on your perspective, mean different things to different people. And often you'll see this with federal legislation. There'll be a somewhat convoluted phrase that everyone can kind of read into that, what it means to them. And then they leave it up to the courts to decide, what does that actually mean? And that's the case with this phrase, waters of the United States. So it means different things to different people. Maybe does it include wetlands? Does it include streams that dry up in the summer? Does it include floodplains? In 2015, President Barack Obama put in place the Waters of the United States rule with an intent to broaden federal protection for wetland streams and small waterways that weren't previously protected under clean water legislation. And the administration wanted to make it clear just what was included under the Clean Water Act. And environmentalists had long argued that the pollution and damage of the small waterways affected drinking water and the ecosystem of the wetlands and required federal protection. And you saw from the map of the basin that I showed at the beginning that there's lots of little rivers in that, little streams, rivers, large rivers in there too. Some considered, depending on who you ask, some considered waters of the United States and some not. So what the Obama administration was trying to do was saying, no, actually, they're all waters of the United States. However, in 2017, the EPA, under the administration of President Donald Trump, rolled back these federal protections, arguing that the Waters of the United States rule was an example of federal overreach and harmed small businesses and landowners across the country. Those who agreed with the Trump administration also advocated for state control over waterways as opposed to federal regulation. And in 2021, the Biden administration filed a legal action to begin the process of repealing the rollbacks from Trump's presidency, aiming to restore federal protection to small waterways and wetlands. But just in January of this year, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case in the term that will start in October of this year, that and the case would define what constitutes waters of the United States. So this waters of the United States issue, as so many issues of clean water are, continues to be legislated and is playing out in real time right before our eyes here. And these images are, oops, go back. These images that you see here are of protests in Vermont at the Capitol by clean water advocates who went to the Vermont Capitol. So today, the fight for clean water in the Lake Champlain Basin continues. I already read that section, so it's still true, even though I already said that. Let me flip my page. Okay, starting again. So despite the large victories symbolized in the passage of the Clean Water Act, the law did not immediately remedy all water problems or relieve waterways from pollution. Protest groups continued to advocate for stringent amendments to the law and government action, sparking a new environmental justice movement in the 1980s that was led by marginalized communities. Systemic racism intertwined with government inaction on water treatment, inspections, and harmful industrial dumping practices in communities has led to devastating water-related tragedies. And these issues continue today, exemplified by the Flint water crisis in 2014, and onward from that date. So city and state officials in Flint, Michigan switched the drinking water supply to the corrosive water from the Flint River and failed to treat it, causing lead from unchecked pipes to leach into the water supply and harm thousands of primarily African-American adults and children. So the environmental justice movement in the 1980s and the Flint water crisis in 2014 demonstrate the uneven application of the Clean Water Act and the need for government officials to uphold the legislation equally across all communities. And also the power of community and protest to come together and call that out publicly and then make legislative change and hopefully systemic change. So discussions about how to enforce the Clean Water Act continue today. Advocates often place less emphasis on individual action and instead call on the government to fully enforce the law. The country's waterways still face major threats from climate change, invasive species, runoff, waste, and pollution. Unsafe drinking water continues to plague the nation, with minority communities unfairly and disproportionately affected. Strong government action on major threats to clean water will help to safeguard our waterways. And while our elected officials continue to debate and take action about clean water, individuals and communities contribute to the efforts to keep the water clean too. Towns and municipalities are working to meet new wastewater regulations, while individuals and businesses are mowing their lawns higher, avoiding the use of lawn fertilizers, and attempting to prevent runoff. Our actions in our everyday lives impact lakes, streams, and all of our connected waterways. So just as Congress ushered in the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, which was landmark legislation that helped to protect our waterways for years to come, individuals, communities, and elected officials today have the responsibility to uphold these policies and continue to protect our water, air, and environment. We all play a part in keeping our water clean, and we all have to work together to continue to make improvements that will make our lake and our region and our communities healthy for the future. So thank you all very much. I'm happy to take some questions and hear your thoughts. Stop sharing my screen. Oh, I will say before I stop sharing the screen that this is an image of one of our snorkeling programs at the museum, where we teach students how to snorkel and then bring them out into the rivers and lakes of our region to have in-water experiences of their own.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, Susan. So like you mentioned, Susan, we're allotting some time for a Q&A, and you can submit your questions using the chat feature on the bottom. And you can either direct those questions to everyone or to myself or to Guy McGuire. And I'll be reading them off to Susan for the purposes of the recording.
I do see one question that came in. Eileen, do you want to read that? Do you want me to read that?
Yeah, so Mark Kennedy asked, what can we do, if anything, related to the case before the Supreme Court about waters of America?
Yes, waters of the United States.
Yes, yep.
You know, that's a great question. I think that's a larger political question that you asked about the Supreme Court. I think as a historian, I'll say that there have been many times in American history where the makeup of the Supreme Court did not necessarily match the makeup of the nation. And in my opinion, we're in that situation again today. So I think there are, you know, I think you should I always say call your legislator. They do actually listen, and depending on where you are, they may or may not agree with what you're going to say, but it's always important to make your voice heard in that way. Even if I'm trying to not say anything specific, but even if you live somewhere where maybe you don't think that your legislator is taking action to protect clean water, it's still really important that you voice your concern for the issue to that legislator so that they will hear that. And it does add up over time.
All right. Guy asked, you mentioned the Clean Water Act didn't address non-point source pollution. Has there been any subsequent legislation nationally or in states that do address that?
There has been. I wonder if Colleen wants, not to put you on the spot, Colleen, but non-point source pollution is something that the Basin Program has done a lot of work to address. So is that something you feel comfortable answering, Colleen?
I couldn't quote you the act, and I should be able to, Susan, but yes, so a lot of work is being done on non-point source pollution control, and a lot of that comes through the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well. They work hand in hand with farmers, providing billions and billions of dollars across the country to help farmers reduce the amount of field drainage that might have pollutants running from their fields to local waterways. And that's often resulting in community projects like local land trusts providing trees to get citizens to plant buffers on a farm field. So it's a commitment by a farmer to use his or her land in order to help reduce pollution. That's one of the examples. Non-point source pollution is something that the Maritime Museum, Elizabeth Lee, and the Basin Program, and Lake Champlain Sea Grant, and the Lake Champlain Committee, we all talk about non-point sources of pollution when we're out and about. Some of it comes right off of urban neighborhoods and yards. For those of us who live in the islands, you'll see non-point sources coming from ditches and driveways or eroding stream banks. So plenty of sources, and the EPA has been, so the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has provided us with a lot of funds and the states with a lot of funds to address these issues and help local communities do so as well. It's a great question.
I will add, just to get back to that waters of the United States question, it is a very contested topic in the agriculture community. I used to, my previous job, do a lot of work in agriculture history, and there is a concern about what is regulated and what isn't, especially when it comes to the phrase that I had often heard people say to me as I was documenting some of their modern stories of agriculture was, is the federal government going to regulate the puddles on my field? With the thought that those puddles dry up in the summer and then fill up in the spring. So I have found it really helpful to kind of hear a lot of different perspectives on that, just to hear where people are coming from. And I think one of the other questions was, is Lake Champlain Maritime Museum planning any special events or exhibits for the anniversary? And yes, we are planning an event series that I think will be called Clean Water Conversations, where that will be our goal, is to bring together people in conversation who maybe would never talk to each other and have a conversation about some of these issues from the past that are still impacting us today. And I always think that's really important, to put all of these issues in conversation together with people who are practitioners in them, right? So people who are doing the work and people who are studying it and people who are studying the science all together in conversation. I always feel like interesting things come out of that, but you don't just get when you hear me talk as a historian. It's always more interesting to hear other voices in that conversation too.
Right. Zoe Smith wants to express her appreciation that we talked about environmental justice, and she's wondering if you or others in Vermont have other stories or projects addressing environmental justice issues in the region.
Yes, there is some great work being done. Well, Vermont DEC actually has an environmental justice team. I'm pretty sure they do. Yes, that is looking at this from the state agency perspective. And then there's lots of really interesting on the ground things happening in communities all over the state, Southern Vermont, Burlington. I think they're at the tip of my, if anybody knows the name of any of these projects, chime in. But there is some really great work happening in the state. And even in a place like Vermont, right, where you think that we can picture ourselves as idyllic sometimes, but there are huge issues of this happening in Vermont as well, where you see that it's mainly communities, marginalized communities or communities of color or communities of lower economic status who are really suffering the impacts of pollution more, health impacts, environmental impacts, and that's happening here too. So.
I think you're muted, Eileen.
Oh,
Sorry, I had another screen open. Catherine says this might be overly simplistic, but what do you see as the greatest threat to our local waterways in the near term, and where are you most hopeful?
That is a great question. I think and this I think is informed a lot by our work with the Basin Program. One of the biggest threats is aquatic invasive species that we are connected by waterways. You know, I talked a lot about the canals and all of the systems that connect us through water, and that's really great in some ways. It also allows invasive species to travel in other ways. And you know, I think that can be daunting sometimes to think about not only how many invasive species are here, but how many more maybe are coming. And the relationship between those invasive species and climate change, specifically in our area, can be scary. But there are really great people working on this too. I never want to have environmental stories just be terrifying, even though they can feel terrifying. And I think the things that I think that makes me feel hopeful about this are the people who are working on these issues. Vermont and New York have really committed groups of conservationists, activists, environmentalists who are working at every level to ensure that these conversations are happening at the state and federal levels. And I think another thing that makes me feel an eternal optimist, but another thing that makes me feel hopeful is I think that there's a shift in the conversation happening that's really important and impactful. You know, when I was in elementary school, we learned you have to recycle, right? Reduce, whatever, the 3 R's, and that's what you do, and then you're great. So it was really on me, third grade Susan, to, you know, recycle my shampoo bottle. And there are often conversations where now it's on me to not buy bottled shampoo, right? To like decrease plastic pollution, which is great. But like I can stop buying shampoo bottles for the rest of my days. But if there are unregulated giant companies who are dumping microplastics into our bodies of water, my shampoo bottles don't actually matter. So I think that while individual action is super important, there's also harnessing that individual action to have collective impact at larger levels is what really makes a difference. And I think those seeing that shift in conversation, I think will get us further more quickly.
All right. So Dave Hobbs asks, South Hero, an island, could be monitoring water quality of our shorelines. What is happening here along those lines? What more could be done?
I know there's a lot of South Hero experts in the room, so I might leave that to the South Hero experts.
So Susan, this is Colleen. I am a resident of South Hero, so I'm jumping in again.
Please do.
So one of the things that happens through the clean water efforts for Lake Champlain is Cyanobacteria Monitoring. And some of you online tonight might be volunteers for the Lake Champlain Committee. The Basin Program helps to fund the Lake Champlain Committee to coordinate what is now a nationally recognized program for training citizen volunteers, local community members to get out and sample lake water quality, usually on a weekly basis, or if there's a big storm event, they might go out and sample again. We do the deep water settings working with the states of New York and Vermont in terms of monitoring water quality, but they have had as many as 150 to 200 volunteers in any given year over the last 10 years collecting samples. I'm pretty sure South Hero has 1 or 2 samplers at least. I think at least one on the East Shore and one on the West Shore. So that provides one example of how the nearshore community is being monitored for water quality. Cyanobacteria can lead to beach closures in large municipal settings. So you'll often hear North Beach or Plattsburgh City Beach or some of the state park beaches being closed occasionally for cyanobacteria. In South Hero, I'm not sure what the monitoring status is on White's Family Beach, but that is one area that may already be monitored as well. But Lake Champlain Committee is always seeking more volunteers to do more work near shore.
And I'll just add too for South Hero folks that the Grand Isle County Natural Resource Conservation District received funding from the Lake Champlain Basin Program, I believe, to do a water quality action plan for Keeler's Bay. And so South Hero Land Trust, we're one of the partners on that project. And so we're going to be looking at Keeler's Bay at non-point source pollution and working with willing landowners to identify potential projects. So places where you could do stream restoration, or tree plantings or things to intercept and slow down water, to filter pollutants, and help do our part to clean up Keeler's Bay. And so this will be kind of like a project that identifies where possible implementation projects could happen, and then we'll have some of those brought up to a 20% or a 40% design. So then we can apply for grants to kind of make those happen. So that's really an exciting partnership project that we're looking forward to. That will be really directly affecting the health of Keeler's Bay. And so we're really thankful for everyone who's helping make it happen. And we will have ways for the public to get involved. So if people are interested in getting involved in that, we will be rolling out some more info about that soon.
All right. James Brightwell asks, which is better, septic systems or sewers for towns in the islands?
I will say that is far outside of my wheelhouse. So maybe Colleen or Guy or someone else want to take that one?
Guy, have you been involved in local conversations about that? Otherwise, I can jump in.
No, that's
Or
way
anybody
above
else
my
can.
pay grade.
It's way above mine too, but I can tell you this much, that I live with a septic system in South Hero. I live with a septic system at my family camp in Georgia, Vermont. And the single house that I own in New Hampshire, where I grew up, is on a municipal system. So it often depends on many factors. Ideally, sometimes a local septic system can treat waste best at the source by distributing it locally. On the other hand, municipal systems have an amazing ability to install technology that's able to remove a greater amount of pollutants when they're gathered together. So Colchester is one of those communities that wrestles with that question. Georgia, Vermont on the shoreline is another community that wrestles with that. So it really depends on the setting. St. Albans Bay, for example, even though it's a U-shaped bay, most of those are individual septic systems. If a septic system is maintained the way it should be and pumped every 3 to 5 years, I think is the current state standard in Vermont, it can be very helpful in keeping that system operating well at the local level. On the other hand, there are a lot of outdated septic systems within the Lake Champlain watershed, and some of our friends from the Adirondacks may have their own perspective. Maybe Zoe has a perspective from Paul Smith College, but it depends on the situation. It depends on the soil's ability to absorb pollutants, and it depends on whether the site is suitable for septic or not. But maintaining that septic system is critically important. And septic systems are really one of those non-point sources of pollution that, if not maintained properly, can drain to nearby waterways. How's that for here's a little bit, but you got to make up your own mind what works. There's Zoe.
I'll just, you said it perfectly, Colleen. And I guess I would just add that it really does depend also on the age and the maintenance of a septic system. And that's what I'm sure you have the same issue over in Vermont that we're finding here, is that they're so expensive to maintain and replace. And some of these camps are so old. So there's never a black and white answer for a lot of these things. So I think you answered it perfectly.
And I will add, if you live somewhere that has a municipal wastewater treatment plant, you should visit. They're very friendly people who are really interesting. Our staff member Elizabeth Lee went to visit the one in Virgins just last week, and they are always happy to talk to you. I think a lot of people who work in this industry are in it because they want clean water too, and they're doing amazing things. So go talk to them. Go visit your local wastewater treatment plant.
And I had to jump in one more time, Eileen, because Laura Hollowell is sitting in the audience, and she's one of our staff members who operates the resource room down at Echo. And she wouldn't let me live the rest of the week if I didn't say, for more detailed information on pollutant sources in Lake Champlain, you can go to the 2021 State of the Lake report. It's a report we produce every 3 years. It has additional resources online as well. But if you go to the Basin Program website, you can pick up a copy, or we're happy to send you a hard copy. And what you will find in that document is wastewater treatment plants in the Lake Champlain region are doing their job. And they're expensive to operate, but they've reduced significant amounts of pollution that impact the waters of Lake Champlain.
And I think someone just put that in the chat as well, so that the link to the report is right there.
I think we maybe want time for just one more question. And that is from Mark. He asks, what relevant bills are in the Vermont Legislator this year? And if we know about like the bill numbers, and if what they address, and what would be helpful to know when we contact our legislators, if anybody knows something about that.
Well, I would say two great places to look are the Vermont Legislature's website has a ton of information on it. There is a House Committee on Natural Resources and a Senate Committee on Natural Resources, and that's where a lot of these bills start. So you can, I was just looking them up because I saw that question. So I'll drop a little link in the chat. So if you have not, you can check them out. And both contacting the chair of the committees can be interesting if you have questions, especially if your legislator is on a committee. That's a great place to start too. They often respond to their constituents first, as they, that's their job. So that they post every week the topics that they're covering. And then that you can also look on that website, and there's a list of bills in and out of committee. So like right now, the list of bills in and out of committee for the House Committee is an act related to the land application of sludge and septage, which sounds very related to what we're talking about. And not all of those bills that are in and out of committee go anywhere, but they start there, and they sometimes end up in other bills that are lumped together.
And I'll just mention too that we can, there's a lot of really great resources being passed around here in the chat. If those are, if folks are worrying if they're, copying those into their browser, we'll collect all of these great resources and all these great links and stuff, and we'll put those together as an email to send out to everybody. So we'll try to get you all some good stuff that if you're wanting to take action and get involved in some of this work.
Yeah, and Elizabeth mentioned that in the chat, the Vermont Clean Water Network too, who does a lot of work around organizing communities on this too, and they're a great place to start, to be directed as to where to go to.
All right, yeah, I'll be circulating some more of those resources tomorrow or the next day when I send a follow-up email to all you guys after this event. But I think that that's all the time that we'll have this evening. And I want to thank Susan so much for this presentation. It was really fascinating, and thank you to everybody who participated. Our next Winter Wednesday will be in 2 weeks on the 16th, and we'll be hosting a sneak peek of No Other Lake, which is a student-made documentary film by Jordan Rowell and Dwayne Peterson about Lake Champlain. And more info about that can be found on our events page, and I'll send more info about that in the follow-up email as well. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This was great.